everybody, this is Mike with On Point Preparedness. In this video, we're going to cover Christian head coverings as it applies to men and women. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, this sounds like a really boring topic for a YouTube video, especially considering the whole host of end time events happening all around us. So why are you covering this and why should I really watch it? First of all, if you read the single page of the Bible in 1 Corinthians 11 on head coverings, and you read it in spirit and you see the symbology of it, you realize that this isn't just about hair and putting a little piece of cloth over your head. It deals with so much more. It is considerate of God's hierarchy, submission, and authority. It reveals the character and nature of angels, and it also will talk about how to prevent supernatural deception, which is rampant in the end times. So we're going to discover all of this, and I've put at least 12 hours of study into this, and it's at a point now where I feel comfortable teaching. Now, head coverings is something that some feel is a type of modesty, but we're not going to cover that in this video. I think a woman can be modest in a whole multitude of ways and does not need a head covering in order to be modest. There is also a concept of head coverings or veils as it applies to a bride when she's being married, and that will somewhat tie into the teaching here, but we're not going to cover on that specifically. We're going to talk about head coverings as it applies to prayer and prophecy, which is discussed in 1 Corinthians 11. Now, this chapter deals a lot with a person's hair or an article of cloth being a head covering for them. And we have to remember at the core that these are physical manifestations of spiritual things. They're symbolic gestures. And before we start to get into the discussion or debate and learning about hair versus an article of cloth being a head covering, which is really going to muck up the water, we really need to see the central theme of this chapter. And there's two things here. Number one, this whole chapter is about God's orderly hierarchy. We see that in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3. Paul says, "But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife or a woman is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." So literally, God the Father is the head of God the Son, Christ. Christ is the head of man, and man is the head of woman. If we think about what this head means, it represents your authority. And the person who is a head over you, the headship over you, is the authority over you. Now, if your head is your authority, what does that mean when you cover it up? I'm covering up my authority. It simply means that you're yielding to, hiding, or submitting to an authority that is greater than you. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 10. Referring to a man being the head of a woman, it says that the head covering is a symbol of authority over her. Paul says that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because the head of woman is man. Now, I know a lot of people are going to get upset about this, some women in particular, thinking that this is all about men ruling and reigning over a woman in terms of matters of the flesh. We just live in a culture that is all about feminism and women power and authority, and this is not what that chapter is talking about at all. In fact, we see in Ephesians 5:25, Paul says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." This is all about biblical authority and biblical submission. So we need to just completely detach our flesh from this discussion and really and truly look at the hierarchy that God has set out here. Now, if you haven't seen my Genesis video on this, you'll see how I put biblical submission as being a form of self-control. You can look up in the top right corner of the screen. If you haven't seen that video, I really do recommend it. Now that we understand this entire chapter is on God's ordained hierarchy and the principles of authority and submission, let's look and see how this applies to man. In verses 4 and 7, Paul writes, "Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God." So what's being taught here? Two key things. In the hierarchy structure, we know that man is the head of woman. This goes all the way back to the Garden of Adam and Eve. Adam was created first, and then Eve was created from Adam. God literally took a rib from Adam's side and created Eve. Paul writes about this in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 8. He says, "For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man." After the fall of creation, this hierarchy order and authority and submission principles were further exemplified for man to be the spiritual head or the spiritual protector over woman, because it was Eve that was deceived by the serpent and Adam was not deceived. This is covered in the Genesis video that I did. Eve was deceived by the serpent when he was tricking her, but then when it came to Adam, Adam knew exactly what Eve had done, and he willfully chose to eat the fruit and die with Eve. He willfully chose his wife over God. And in 1 Timothy 2, we read about this. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Therefore, God has assigned born-again Christian men to serve as a spiritual protector or headship over women. Just as God has authority over man, man made in God's image has also been given a type of authority. Now, this is an incredibly important discussion for the end times because man made in God's image was meant to be an authoritative figure, to be a spiritual protector for his wife and for the women in his lives. And I've seen this go two completely different ways, and I'll use real life experiences from this whole Torah observance thing. I've had a multitude of women email me and say that they were looking on the internet into Torah observance, and it was only until their husbands got involved, their true born-again Christian husbands, that said, this is a false gospel. This isn't biblical. This is a false Christ. And then they both were saved. It is not to say that men cannot be deceived. Men can certainly be deceived. But a true doctrinally sound born-again Christian man is very set in his ways and is very insensitive to various other types of doctrines, and he will serve as that spiritual protector over his wife and over the women in his lives. Now, this is completely opposite to when a man shrieks back and cowers in the authority that was given to him and allows the wife to do whatever she wants. We're using Torah observance as an example. I've also seen women that have gotten into Torah observance and then started teaching their husbands about it and leading them into it, and then they both fall. This is absolutely no different than what happened in the Garden of Adam and Eve. It was Eve leading Adam, and they both fell, and it was Adam failing to adhere to his authoritative responsibilities and protect Eve. Now, I know a lot of women aren't going to like this. A lot of women are going to say that I'm independent, which you are, and that I can, be a teacher and I can teach others, but this is very slippery slope. There's only half-truths in here. The Bible has plenty of examples where elder women are teaching younger women. There's also examples of where women are teaching and raising their children, and there's also examples of where women provide counsel to men. But the difference is the woman does not have authority of teaching or authority over man. She provides guidance, she provides counsel, and then man will make the decision for the household. It's in 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Now, Jacob Prash, who is a really good teacher, if you haven't checked him out, I really do suggest his videos. He says it best, men are insensitive. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. A good, born-again, doctrinally sound Christian man is solid in his doctrine, and he's very insensitive with regards that he will not easily budge from what he understands as truth, regardless of emotions or circumstances. However, we know with women, they can generally be more sensitive than man, especially with their emotions, and there's good and bad things to this. In terms of a loving and caring attitude, women are more sensitive and women are more emotional, and that is very, very good. But then we also know, and women know themselves, that sometimes emotions can get in the way of decision making, and this is especially where the man comes in, not having very emotional feelings or sensitivities about the event and looks at it just very narrow-mindedly and says yes or no. This is where we all balance each other out in our roles and responsibilities. Now, 2, we understand that man was given an authoritative privilege. He has a headship of authority over woman. Well, what happens if he covers that up? What if he yields to that? What if he hides and shrieks back and cowers? He is not fulfilling the authoritative privileges that God gave to him. He's acting just like Adam in failing to be a spiritual protector, in failing to be an authoritative figure. And so it's a dishonor to his head being Christ. You're dishonoring God. You're not being in his image as an authoritative figure. This does not mean that there is no submission. Man is definitely always supposed to submit to his head, but as it relates to the authoritative privileges given to man, he is not to hide that. He is supposed to exercise that, and that's why God says here through Paul, man is not to cover his head. He's not to cover the authoritative privilege given to him. All right, so now how we understand headship for men and the authoritative figure that was granted to him as a privilege, let's look and see what it says about woman. In 1 Corinthians 11, it says, "But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." We'll talk about angels in a little second, because that's probably the coolest part of this whole teaching. But again, the head of woman is man. The woman is therefore called to be biblically submissive to the headship, to her husband, to man. When she presents herself before God in prayer or in prophecy, she's essentially acknowledging the hierarchy, she's acknowledging her headship, and she's purposely being submissive. Now, what does it mean about a woman being the glory of man? So, women want a man that loves them, and what man wants from a woman is he wants respect. Society teaches that as well, that a man wants to be known as the leader of his household. He wants that respect. And if a woman usurps that authority, she doesn't cover up and submit to the authority that is over her, the headship of the husband over her, and she rebels in authority, again, usurping his own authority and leadership, she dishonors her head. She dishonors her husband. Actually, in Proverbs 21:9, it says, "It is better to live in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife." And this is exactly what it's teaching. Woman is the glory of man, and if she is truly being biblically submissive, that is the glory of man, and both are in each their own roles, fulfilling each other, and the household is perfect. But again, if she tries to usurp that authority, then it's a dishonor to her husband, it's a dishonor to her head. So now that you understand this entire chapter revolves around God's ordained hierarchy and the headship and authority and submission, now we'll start to get into the difference between a hair being head coverings or an article of cloth being a physical head covering. Before we even get into that, you'll find it incredibly interesting that society itself adheres to biblical principles without even knowing it. We're going to first cover the physical head covering, and then we'll talk about hair later. But check this out from levinehat.com. And we all know this. Men's hat etiquette guidelines. A gentleman should remove his hat as he enters a building, including a restaurant, home, classroom, theater, church. Also, during the Pledge of Allegiance or the Star-Spangled Banner, men remove their hats. Now, we're taught that it's a form of respect, but as you'll see here, look at the women's hat etiquette guidelines. Women do not need to remove their hats indoors as men do, unless they are rain hats. So, is it really about respect? Or is it because men take off their hats because they're not to dishonor their head, they're not supposed to have a covering over their authority, but women are allowed to have the hat, they're allowed to have a head covering as a symbol of authority. It's very interesting that society itself teaches you these things. All right, so let's dig a little bit more into the Bible and see what Paul says about physical head coverings first, and then we'll get into hair a little bit later. Now, I have to be abundantly clear with you. Paul very clearly and articulately expresses the primary desire for a woman to have a physical head covering over her head. It's not to say that she needs one during every hour of the day. It's specifically during prayer or prophecy that she is to wear this. Later, he goes on to say that a woman's hair is also a natural head covering. So what is he meaning here? He's basically saying that I don't want divisions in the church. If a physical head covering versus hair is going to cause divisions, judge for yourselves. Stop quarreling about little minor things. But that does not mean that he still expresses the desire that a woman have a physical head covering over her head. In verse 16, he says, "If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God." Some people say that this verse simply implies that a Christian woman must wear a head covering. But it's not true, because if you look at the entire chapter of 1 Corinthians, the entire letter of 1 Corinthians, he's talking about divisions in the church, and most of the divisions being about physical things being caused by infants in Christ who are still living in the flesh. So in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 10, he says, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. Later in 1 Corinthians 3, he says, "But brothers, I could not address you as spiritual people, but as the people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you are not yet ready, for you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh, behaving only in human ways? Again, this is the whole teaching we've been doing a lot here. Only thinking with fleshly eyes, never thinking about the Spirit. So Paul really does not want divisions in the church over physical things. But as I show you in these couple verses, he wants women to wear a physical head covering during prayer or prophecy. So let's read about this. It says, "But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if it were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels." So you can see Paul is not mincing words here. He is definitively expressing the primary desire that women keep with the traditions of the church and put a physical head covering over their heads during prayer or prophecy to show that biblical submission. It's all because of the angels, which we'll discuss here. And he's like, if you're not willing to do that, just chop off all your hair. And we know, and it says later, that a woman's hair is her glory. I think every woman watching knows that it would be absolutely shameful to just shave off your whole head. She's like, you don't want that. You don't want to dishonor yourself. And you don't want to do that because that'd be a dishonor to your husband. So just please, I implore you, put the physical head covering over your head. Now, why? It's because of the angels. So now here's the really cool part. Why do women put a physical head covering on? Because of the angels. Let's look at a couple verses throughout the Bible. Hebrews 10:1. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now, if you look at commentary about Hebrews 10:1, it says that the witnesses are some of the saints and martyrs before us, which may or may not be true, I'm not sure. But I also believe that the great witnesses among us is also angels. They're watching us, they're observing us, they're seeing what we do. And the reason I say that is, let's look at a couple more verses here. Luke 15:10 says, "In the same way I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents." The angels are watching us. When someone repents, the angels see this, and all heaven with the angels rejoice. It's a great cloud of witnesses. Also in 1 Peter 1, verse 12, it says, "It was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves, but you," people in the past of the Old Testament, "in the things that have now been announced to you through those who preach the good news to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things into which angels long to look." So angels are definitely watching us, but what else? So 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 3 says, "Do you not know that we are to judge angels in the next life? How much more then matters pertaining to this life?" So you see through these handful of verses, angels are definitely watching us. They are witnesses of everything that we're doing here on this earth. And herein lies the matter why a woman is to put on a physical head covering when she prays or prophesies before God. God is the only entity, if you will, that can see into the hearts and minds of men. Angels can't really see into our hearts and minds. Demons can't. They're only observing what we do in the physical realm here. And so when a woman comes before God to pray or prophecy, and she performs the physical act of taking a physical object and putting it on her physical head, she is witnessing to the angels. She is demonstrating to the angels that she understands God's ordained hierarchy, that she is coming before God, and she is submissive. All those physical things the angels are witnessing, and we're teaching them. There's things that they long to look into. And if a woman were to not do that, and just use her hair as a physical head covering, or just have her hair as a head covering, it's still fine, it's not sin. But an angel can't look into your mind. An angel doesn't know whether you're coming before God in terms of understanding the ordained hierarchy and coming before Him in submission under the headship that you're under. They just can't. But they can definitely see you doing the physical act. And so that is why it's preferred by Paul, because the angels are watching us. Now, I've heard a lot of different opinions from people saying that, oh, that can't be the reason, Mike. It's because a woman has to wear this physical head covering so the angels don't lust after her and want to have sex with her. This really starts to tie into what people read in Enoch, which is something that I personally don't read, and also ties into things mentioned in Genesis 6. Now, I do not think this is true as it pertains to this chapter, and I'll show you why, but there is some half-truths to it. So why is this chapter not specifically about an angel lusting after a woman and wanting to have relations with her if she does not cover her head physically before prayer or prophecy? The reason is this. Why is it limited to just prayer or prophecy? Why wouldn't Paul say, women, don't go into the shower, make sure you're covered up then, or when you're getting intimate with your husband, make sure you're covered up then because we don't want angels lusting after you. It doesn't really make a lot of sense when it's just about prayer or prophecy before God. The other thing too is I guess bald women are super hot for angels. If you only think about things in the physical, that's what it means. But I say it's a half-truth because I do think that there is angels lusting after a woman that is not submissive to authority. And so here's what I mean by that. If, again, completely thinking about things in the spiritual terms, if a woman usurps authority, if she's rebellious, if she wants to be a leader over the man, especially if she does things like chopping off her hair, which is a symbol of pride and rebellion, which we're going to discover in a little bit here. If she does all those things, demons, fallen angels, are going to look at that and they're going to go after that woman. They're going to say, oh, we got an in here. So let's look at 2 Peter 2, talking about angels. It says, but these, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction, suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing. They count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions while they feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. Check that out. This is so important. If a woman is rebelling against authority, if she wants to be over man, if you see this feminist movement, the angels will lust after that woman, not in the physical sense that they want to have sexual relationships with that woman. They want to dine with her. They want to feast with this woman. They want to entice her unsteady soul. They want her to commit adultery in a spiritual sense, and that means going after other gods. All throughout the Old Testament, we see that the adulterous nation of Israel was not because they were having sex with other gods. It was because they were worshiping other gods. They were breaking the marriage covenant that was with God. They were being adulterous, and it's the same thing here. So no, angels aren't lusting after women, wanting to have sexual relationships with them because they're not wearing a physical head covering. But if a woman completely usurps authority and is being rebellious, yeah, demons are going to look and say, that one. I'm going to go after that one. And they're going to want to dine with your spirit and feed you all sorts of bad soul food. And this doesn't just apply to women, it applies to the men as well. If a man refuses to exhort his authoritative position as a spiritual protector over his wife or over the women in his lives, demons will go after that guy too. They see that he's cowardly and shrieking back at authority, and they'll want to dine with him too. They're going to want to manipulate him into sin too and be adulterous and go after other gods because he doesn't have the authority. He's not acting like a man. He's not being a spiritual protector. And they say, oh, look, he's weak. We're going to go after that one. That's how it works. All right, so now we understand the reason why we have to have a physical, or women rather, should have a physical head covering on their head for prayer or prophecy. Now let's get into hair. This is also really cool. I'm going to show you what society teaches us about hair, and then I'll get into what Paul teaches us in the Word of God. So check out this picture here. This is from a book in 1978, and it talks about the trend of how women cutting their hair equals power. So hairstyles. What tests well for the businesswoman? Short, shorter length, no longer hair. Short, wavy, though not curly hair. And short, not masculine hair. Now, what tests poorly for the business one? If you look at D, too long, long hair. Tests poorly for the businesswoman. Or E, too curly. The curly aspect really isn't getting into our study here, but you can see what tests well for the businesswoman in terms of exerting authority and power is a short hairstyle versus what tests poorly for them and makes them seem, weak or submissive is a long hairstyle. In fact, if you look at this other graphic here, Fortune Women, according to 1978 hair typology, this looked at 50 of the top business women in America at that time and how they categorized with those hairstyles. Check that out. You've got 40 out of the 50 women that are all in the short hair category. And then look at D in terms of testing poorly. Only 8 of the entire 50 had long hair. So you can see short hair, as society teaches us, almost implies like you have more authority or more power, and then long hair makes you seem more weak or submissive. That was in 1978. Let's just look at current day. You can see that society and news media and entertainment is all about women liberating themselves and chopping off their hair so that they can have more authority and more power. Look at this one, Beyonce's haircut, the meaning behind her new short style. It says, in fact, this being Beyonce, it isn't a haircut at all. According to her stylist, it's a statement that I'm young, I'm beautiful, and I can do it all. She can do it all. If only the feminist movement had known about this years ago, instead of bothering with all that activism, all a woman had to do was cut off her hair and she could do it all. Let's look at some of these other articles. Babel, I believe the power of the pixie cut. Tulane, another website, power to the pixie. 5 reasons to try a pixie cut this summer. Another article, short change, the power of the pixie haircut. Is short hair the new power move? This other website, Man Repeller, the restorative power of a good pixie cut. So as I taught in a different video, you can see that society itself teaches that shorter hair almost implies that you have more power or more authority, and longer hair is more submissive. And these women that are chopping off their hair are doing it in the spirit of usurping authority. I want power. I want authority. I'm not under man. I am a feminist. Again, it's not the actual cutting of your hair, it's the motive in which you're doing it. Again, if you only think with physical eyes, you start to get into these debates, which you'll find on the internet. You get into these debates where people are saying, well, a woman should have hair that's as long as it will grow out. And if you cut it at all, you're biblically incorrect and you're being disobedient to the word. And so literally, if there's a woman that has like hair to here and she gets it cut up to shoulder length, they're like, oh, you're disobedient to the word. That's a sin. You're going against God. No, it isn't. It's not necessarily about just cutting inches off your hair. It's symbolically showing that if you chop off your hair, again, in a motive or spirit of rebellion, that is what it means to cut your hair short and be against God. Not just, being an older lady and having a perm and it's, just short. That's not being biblically disobedient to the word. It's all about motives. It's all about spiritual things, spiritual eyes. So Paul talks about hair in the next couple verses here. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Otherwise, is it proper for a woman to usurp authority and not be biblical submissive according to the ordained hierarchy that God had put in place? No, it's not. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? Again, if a man covers up his head, which is his authority, he shrieks back at the responsibility or privilege given to him to be an authoritative figure. Is that not a disgrace? Is that not a dishonor? Yes, it is. He's not acting like a man. But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. And so this really gets into matters of conscience. Again, I want you to think about this with spiritual eyes, not physical eyes. People will start to just mutilate this chapter and say, well, it almost starts to sound like the Jewish Talmud, the oral written law. Well, a woman's hair can be within 12 to 14 inches long, but no shorter than 10 inches long. Unless your hair can only grow to a certain length, then that's fine. You start to get in all these rules and regulations. It's not necessarily about the length of your hair. It somewhat is, but that's more of a matter of conscience. What really matters is what's going on in your heart. and what's going on in spirit, the unseen. If you have long hair, women, you have long hair all the way down to the middle of your back, it's getting really hard to manage. You want to have something a little bit shorter, near the shoulder length, and it's just because you want more free time and not have to just basically, brush your hair all the time. Go ahead and do it. It's not a sin. You're not going against God. But if you're like a lot of these feminists and you say, I'm tired of this. I am chopping off my hair. I want power. I want authority. I don't want to be submissive. I am a feminist. Well, now you're in biblical disobedience. Now you're going against the Word of God. Same thing as it applies to men. If you have longer hair because that's your style, but you're still exhorting your authority, the privilege granted to you by God as being a spiritual protector for your wife if you have one, or for the women in your life, I would say you're in obedience to the Word. But again, this really comes into matters of conscience. You can see how society teaches that long hair is submissive and shorter hair is more authoritative. Some people may choose to follow that because their conscience tells them that. But if your conscience isn't seared, and you're a man with longer hair or you're a woman with shorter hair and you're being completely submissive or authoritative, you're adhering to your role as it is in the ordained biblical hierarchy, you're in obedience to the Word. Think in spirit, think in terms of the motivation with why you're doing things, and don't get so caught up in all these physical rules and regulations, because it will lead down the path of all these arguments talking about hair length and this many inches and under what different circumstances. Oh, and if you have cancer, and then, oh, well, it's okay then. It starts to become absolute madness. So I hope you found this study to be really interesting. It covers so many different things. And I'll end with this one really important thing. I talk a lot about the Pope. I talk about how he's the anti-John the Baptist of the Antichrist. He's really paving the way for the Antichrist to come. And check out this article. This is about dress code for private sessions with the Pope. And specifically for women, part of the required dress code for a woman to present herself to the Pope in private is to wear a head covering or a veil. Now, what did we learn just now in 1 Corinthians? That when a woman comes before God in prayer or prophecy, she's to cover her head. What is the Pope doing here? He's setting himself up as God. He's saying, when you come before me, women, put on a head covering, for I am God. We know, and this is only one example of it, the Pope sets himself up as God. Papal infallibility, that he sits in the chair of Peter. He is setting himself up as God. And again, I don't think he's the Antichrist specifically, but I think he is the John the Baptist, if you will, paving the way for him. And this is just another crazy example. Anywho, I really hope that you enjoyed this. As you've seen, we just covered a whole ton of stuff. It dealt with angels and the fact that they're witnessing us. It talks about God's hierarchy, authority, submission. It talks about, acting as a family unit, each in our own roles, protecting each other during this end times, especially, with the internet having tons of information, a lot of it which is crap. You need to not just be going out on your own and just consuming everything that's on the internet. So many false teachers out there, so many people teaching really bad stuff. You need to study the Bible together. If you are going to go on the internet and research different things, make sure you bring it back to one another and discuss it at home. It's going to be in my next video. There's so much deception occurring. It's absolutely insane. I see people in my everyday life falling left and right. And so, I hope this video was a blessing to you. I hope you learned a lot from it. And until the next one, this is Mike, On Point Preparedness. See you guys.